Okay, so now that we have users able to actually log into our application, right, by using this sign in with email and password function that Firebase Auth provides to us, the next thing that we need to do is have our application actually update when that event occurs, right? So in other words, when the user successfully enters in their email and their correct password, we want to have our app actually know that that happened and redirect the user automatically to the home page. Now, the way that this is going to work is inside our app component, we're actually going to have a state variable, and we're going to call this state variable user and set user. You'll see why that is in just a minute. And here, let's just import use state up at the top while we're at it. Use state from React. And then we'll say use state, and the initial value of this is going to be null. Okay, so essentially the way that this is going to work is Firebase provides us with a function called onAuthStateChanged that basically allows us to set up a subscription that will listen for changes to Firebase's authentication state, right? In other words, when a user logs in or logs out, the callback that we pass to this function will be called with the user that just logged in, right? A Firebase user object. You'll see what that looks like shortly. So the way that we use this, first of all, we're going to import that from the Firebase package up here at the top. We're going to say import get auth and on auth state changed. That's the function that I just told you about that allows us to set up that subscription. And we're going to import those from Firebase/auth. Now, the other thing that we're going to need to do in order to set up a subscription in pretty much any React component, we want to do that inside a use effect hook. So let's import use effect from React up at the top. And we're going to use that now to actually set up this subscription that will allow us to keep track of this user thing. So we're going to say use effect. And for the use effect callback, we're going to create our subscription. So we'll say const auth equals get auth, right? We're getting that reference to Firebase's auth object. And then what we're going to do is say on auth state changed. We're passing auth as the first argument, and as the second argument, we pass a callback, and this callback will actually get the user, the currently logged in Firebase user object, as an argument. And then what we need to do is inside this callback, we need to set our user state appropriately. So basically what's happening is that when the user first opens up our application, right, and we have user and set user equal to null, that just means that our user is initially unauthenticated before they actually log in. So what we're going to do is when this changes, we're just going to say set user to user, and that's about it for now. So the other thing that we need to do now is, since we no longer have an isAuthed variable, right? We just had that as a hard-coded variable before. We're actually going to use this user, right? The user state to tell whether or not the user's logged in. And that's actually pretty straightforward to do because, again, all we have to do is check if this user exists. If the user doesn't exist, that means the user's not logged in. If the user does exist, it means the user is logged in. Simple as that. So what we're going to do is for isAuthed, for both our auth and unauthed routes, we're going to pass through double exclamation point user. Now what this double exclamation point does, if you haven't seen this before, is basically it just takes any value in JavaScript and converts it to a Boolean. It's basically asking, does this thing exist? And if user's null, this will be false. And if user is, an actual object, this will translate into true. So just wanted to point that out there in case you weren't familiar with that syntax. And that's pretty much all we have to do. So if we go back to our application now, we'll see that since we've already logged in, we're on the home page. So what you might want to do here is, if you want to test this, since we currently have no way to log out, you can always just open up an incognito window and go to localhost 3000, and that will basically allow you to see the page without any of the stored credentials. So what you can do is just test out the login here by saying sean@gmail.com, entering in your password, clicking login. You'll see successfully logged in, click OK, and that should send you now to the home route. Now, one thing to notice is that it's sending you to the home route automatically, not because we are saying history.push or anything, right? We don't even have history inside our login page. It's happening automatically because of the logic that we have inside our authed and unauthed routes. Okay, essentially, those are detecting this change to is authed, right? There is auth prop, and automatically taking care of all the redirection logic. So we don't have to do that kind of logic inside our home and login pages with the current setup that we have. All right, now one last thing that we are going to want to do is make sure that while our application is actually loading, it doesn't display the login page, right? You might have noticed that if you refresh, it'll automatically show the login page because, again, our user is initially null while our application is taking care of actually logging the user in behind the scenes. So what we need to do is basically we need to have another state variable here, which we'll call isLoading and set isLoading. And what this is going to do is basically while our app is checking whether the user is logged in, right? It's checking with Firebase. This is going to be true. And once we see that either the user is or is not logged in, right? Once we find out for sure from Firebase, which is the case, we're going to set isLoading to false. So what this is going to look like, the initial value for isLoading is actually going to be, we're going to need this auth thing down here. We're going to need to say const auth equals get auth, and the initial value here is going to be basically whether or not the current user exists on auth. Now, what I just did here, this auth.currentUser thing, this is just a property that contains the current user object that's logged in. Now, note that since this can change over time, we don't actually want to use this for ongoing things, right? We won't want to say isAuthed equals auth.currentUser because this thing could change over time and that would not trigger a subsequent re-render in React. But in our case here, it's perfectly fine to use it as the initial value for a state variable. All we're doing here is if there's already a current user, we're just going to set isLoading to false. If there's not, we're going to set isLoading to true because that means we don't really know whether the user is already logged in or not. And we're going to do something similar for the user down here in useState. We're going to say equals useState, and the initial value for that is going to be auth.currentUser. So essentially, if the user is already logged in and we already have auth.currentUser, we're not going to see that loading state. Otherwise, we're going to see a loading message, which we actually have to display down here. The way we'll do that is just by saying return is loading. If it is loading, we'll just say loading ... Oops. Otherwise, we'll display the regular JSX. So the other thing that we have to do is after we've set the user, we need to say set isLoading to false so that in case it was true to begin with, and it will be a lot of the time, it will turn to false once the user is actually logged in. Now this will work as is right now, right? If we click refresh, we'll see loading and then home, loading home, etc. One more thing that we have to do just for cleanliness sake and to prevent memory leaks is we have to make sure to cancel this subscription when our app component re-renders. So essentially what we're going to have to do is this onAuthState changed function actually returns a function that will cancel the subscription for you. So what we'll do is say const cancel subscription equals onAuthState changed, blah, blah, blah. And then we're just going to return the cancel subscription function from this useEffect hook, which basically means that this cancel subscription thing will be called when our component unmounts. And the last thing we need to do here is, since we only want to set up that subscription once, we're just going to pass an empty array as a second argument to useEffect. Okay, so this should all work now, and if we open up the inspector window here in console, we shouldn't see any kind of, here. So this one warning just says that we need to pass auth as a dependency, just in case that changes over time. It shouldn't, but just to make React happy and to get rid of that warning, why not? Okay, and everything seems to be working now. The last thing that we're going to do here, and this is a very, very simple thing to implement, we're going to add a logout button so that we can actually log out of our application. So what this is going to look like is inside our home page. We're going to open that up. What we're going to do is just add a basic logout button to the bottom of the page that will allow the user to click on it and actually log themselves out. Okay, now in order to make this happen, we just need to import getAuth and a function called signout from the Firebase Auth package. Okay, and we're going to basically create a function here called logout. It's going to be an async function that will basically call this signout function for us. So what we're going to do inside of here, we're going to say const auth equals getAuth. We're going to say await signout and pass auth as an argument. And then we're just going to display an alert that says something like successfully logged out. Okay, and then we just need to wrap these in a React fragment to make React happy with our syntax, and we'll have the button call this logout function by saying onClick equals logout. And that should be our logout button. So as you can see, the logic here is incredibly simple for logging out a user, and essentially all that does is just deletes some tokens behind the scenes that Firebase is using to create the user session. So let's go over here to our homepage now. We can click log out. We should see successfully logged out, and we'll see that that has automatically now redirected us back to the login page. So just to go through the flow one more time, we'll say sean@gmail.com, abc123, log in, successfully logged in, and we're at our home page. So everything seems to be working just fine now, and we've successfully added Firebase Auth to a React application. So I hope this has been informative for you, and I'd like to thank you for viewing.